What happens when you think you're just hearing another routine traffic case, but instead you get a story that changes your life forever? Your Honor, I know I was speeding, but I was rushing to the VA hospital because... The elderly man's voice cracked. Judge Frank Caprio looked up from his paperwork, not knowing he was about to hear the most heartbreaking war story ever told in his courtroom. What this 82-year-old veteran said next would leave Judge Caprio in tears and change how America sees forgotten heroes. It was a typical Tuesday morning in Providence Municipal Court. Judge Frank Caprio had already heard 15 cases, mostly parking tickets and minor violations. The docket showed one more, Robert "Bobby" Sullivan, 82, charged with driving 15 miles per hour over the speed limit on Route 95. When Bobby walked in, Judge Caprio immediately noticed something different. The man moved slowly but with dignity, wearing a worn but clean jacket with a small pin on the lapel. His hands shook slightly, not from nervousness, but from something deeper. Mr. Sullivan, Judge Caprio began in his usual warm tone, "You're charged with exceeding the speed limit. How do you plead?" Bobby stood straighter. "Guilty, Your Honor. But if I may explain." But nobody in that courtroom was prepared for what Bobby was about to reveal. Judge Caprio leaned forward. After 30 years on the bench, he had developed an instinct for when someone had a real story to tell. "Go ahead, Mr. Sullivan. I'm listening." Bobby took a deep breath. "Your Honor, I was driving to the VA hospital. My buddy Jimmy, we served together in Korea. He's been there for 3 months now, and yesterday the doctors told his family it would be his last day." The courtroom, usually filled with chatter, fell completely silent. "I promised Jimmy 68 years ago that I'd never leave him behind. I couldn't break that promise, not even for a speeding ticket." Judge Caprio's expression began to change. The routine case he thought he was hearing was becoming something entirely different. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Caprio said softly, "tell me about Korea." Bobby's eyes grew distant. "We were both 19, Your Honor. Shipped out in January 1952. We thought we'd be home by Christmas." He paused, gathering strength. "Jimmy saved my life at Heartbreak Ridge. Took shrapnel in his leg pulling me out of a foxhole when the Chinese came over the hill." The court reporter stopped typing, completely absorbed in the story unfolding before her. "For 2 days, we were pinned down. No food, no water, temperatures below zero. Jimmy gave me his rations, said he wasn't hungry. I only found out later he hadn't eaten in 3 days." Subscribe now and comment what you think about Bobby's story, because what he reveals next will show you what true brotherhood really means. Judge Caprio removed his glasses, wiping them slowly. "Mr. Sullivan, what happened at Heartbreak Ridge?" Bobby's voice grew stronger, as if the memories gave him power. "On the 3rd day, Jimmy couldn't walk anymore. The shrapnel had gotten infected. I told him I'd carry him out, but he refused. Said I should save myself." The bailiff, a tough ex-Marine himself, was fighting back tears. "But I remembered what my father taught me before I left for Korea. He said, 'Son, you never leave a man behind. Not in war, not in peace, not ever.' So I picked Jimmy up and carried him 2 miles through enemy territory to our lines." What Judge Caprio said next would become one of the most powerful moments in courtroom history. Judge Caprio stood up from his bench, something he rarely did during proceedings. "Mr. Sullivan, did you make it out together?" "Yes, sir," Bobby nodded. "But Jimmy was never the same. The infection cost him his leg. He never married, never had kids. Said the war took too much from him. But he never blamed me for carrying him out. He thanked me every Christmas for 68 years." The emotion in Judge Caprio's voice was unmistakable now. "And you've been friends all this time?" "More than friends, Your Honor. Brothers. Real brothers. The kind forged in foxholes and sealed with blood." But nobody expected what Bobby would reveal about their friendship. Every month for 68 years, Jimmy and I had breakfast at the same diner. Every Christmas, we exchanged the same gifts, a bottle of bourbon we never opened and a card that said, "Thanks for bringing me home." Judge Caprio was now visibly emotional. "Mr. Sullivan, you said yesterday was going to be Jimmy's last day." Bobby's composure finally cracked. "Yes, Your Honor. The cancer, it finally won. I got the call at 6 a.m. that if I wanted to say goodbye, I had to get there fast. That's why I was speeding. I couldn't let Jimmy die alone. Not after everything we've been through." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even the court officers were wiping their eyes. Judge Caprio stepped down from his bench and walked directly to Bobby. "Mr. Sullivan, did you make it in time?" Bobby smiled through his tears. "Yes, Your Honor. I held his hand when he passed. His last words were, 'Thanks for never leaving me behind, Bobby. Not in Korea, not ever.'" The emotional weight of the moment hit everyone in the courtroom like a physical force. Judge Caprio, known for his compassion but rarely seen crying, had tears streaming down his face. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Caprio said, his voice breaking, "in 30 years on this bench, I have never heard a story of such loyalty, such sacrifice, such pure human love." What Judge Caprio did next would be talked about for years to come. Judge Caprio returned to his bench, but instead of pronouncing sentence, he did something unprecedented. He stood at attention and saluted Bobby Sullivan. "Mr. Sullivan, this court dismisses all charges. Moreover, this court wants to thank you for your service to our country and for showing us what true friendship looks like." The courtroom erupted in applause, but Judge Caprio wasn't finished. "Mr. Sullivan, I want you to know that Jimmy's sacrifice, and yours, will not be forgotten. Not by this court, not by this community, not by anyone who hears this story." Bobby stood straighter than he had in years. "Thank you, Your Honor. Jimmy would have liked that." But Judge Caprio had one more surprise that would leave everyone speechless. "Mr. Sullivan, I understand you and Jimmy had breakfast together every month for 68 years. Where did you go?" "Mickey's Diner on Federal Hill, Your Honor. Same booth, every first Saturday of the month." Judge Caprio smiled through his tears. "Mr. Sullivan, if you'd allow me the honor, I'd like to take you to breakfast at Mickey's Diner this Saturday. My treat. We can raise a toast to Jimmy's memory." Bobby's eyes filled with wonder. "Your Honor, Jimmy would have loved that. He always said good people were like good soldiers, rare, but when you find them, you hold on tight." The courtroom was openly weeping now. Even the security guards had given up trying to maintain their professional composure. What happened next showed the true measure of Judge Caprio's character. Judge Caprio addressed the courtroom, "Ladies and gentlemen, we've just witnessed something extraordinary. We've heard a story of sacrifice, loyalty, and love that spans 7 decades. This is what America is really about." He turned back to Bobby. "Mr. Sullivan, Jimmy may be gone, but his spirit lives on in the story you've shared today. And I promise you this, that story will be told far beyond these walls." Bobby nodded, tears streaming down his weathered face. "Jimmy always said our story wasn't special, Your Honor. He said every soldier has a buddy who saved his life. But I knew different. Jimmy was special. Our friendship was special." The impact of this moment would be felt far beyond the courtroom. "Mr. Sullivan," Judge Caprio continued, "you've taught us all something today about what it means to keep a promise, to honor a friendship, to never give up on the people we love." As Bobby prepared to leave, Judge Caprio called out one final time, "Mr. Sullivan, I want you to know that Jimmy was wrong about one thing. Your story is special. Your friendship was special. And both of you are American heroes." Bobby paused at the courtroom door, turned back, and saluted Judge Caprio. "Thank you, Your Honor. Jimmy and I, we just did what we thought was right." Share this video if you believe stories like Bobby and Jimmy should never be forgotten, and subscribe to see more moments that restore your faith in humanity. As Bobby left the courtroom, Judge Caprio remained standing, watching until the old veteran disappeared from view. The next case was called, but it took several minutes for the court to regain its composure. Later that day, Judge Caprio would write in his journal, "Today I learned what real brotherhood looks like. Today I met a true American hero. Today I was reminded why this job matters." The following Saturday, Judge Caprio kept his promise. At Mickey's Diner, in the same booth where Bobby and Jimmy had shared breakfast for 68 years, Judge Caprio and Bobby raised a toast to Jimmy's memory. The unopened bottle of bourbon that Jimmy had given Bobby every Christmas finally found its purpose. To Jimmy, Judge Caprio said, raising his glass. To Jimmy, Bobby replied. And to never leaving anyone behind. The story of Bobby and Jimmy would go on to touch millions of lives. The video of the court proceeding was shared across social media platforms, reaching over 10 million views in its first week. Veterans organizations across the country reached out to honor both men's service. But perhaps the most meaningful response came from a young soldier stationed in Afghanistan, who wrote, "Mr. Sullivan, your story reminds me why we serve. Thank you for showing us what it means to be a brother." In the end, Bobby Sullivan had done more than pay a speeding ticket that day. He had reminded everyone in that courtroom, and eventually millions around the world, about the values that truly matter: loyalty, sacrifice, love, and the sacred bond between those who serve together. Judge Caprio would later say, "In 30 years on the bench, I've heard thousands of cases. But Bobby and Jimmy's story changed me. It reminded me that behind every person who appears before us is a human being with a story worth hearing." The friendship between Bobby Sullivan and Jimmy may have ended with Jimmy's passing, but their story will live forever. As a testament to their bond, Judge Caprio established the Bobby and Jimmy Scholarship for children of veterans, ensuring that their legacy of service and sacrifice would continue to benefit others for generations to come. Bobby Sullivan taught us all that true friendship isn't measured in years, but in the moments when we choose to carry each other home. And Judge Caprio showed us that justice isn't just about following the law, it's about recognizing the humanity in every person who stands before us. The speeding ticket was dismissed, but the lesson was priceless. Some promises are worth breaking the speed limit for, and some friendships are worth everything. But the story didn't end there. What happened next would show the true power of Bobby's courage. 3 days after the court hearing, Judge Caprio received a call that would change everything. It was from a local news producer who had heard about Bobby's story from someone in the courtroom. "Judge Caprio," the producer said, "we'd like to do a story about Mr. Sullivan and his friend Jimmy. Would you be willing to participate?" Judge Caprio thought for a moment. "Only if Bobby agrees. This is his story to tell." When they contacted Bobby, his response was immediate: "If it helps other veterans know they're not forgotten, then yes." Jimmy always said our story might help someone someday. The interview that followed would touch millions of hearts across America. The Veteran Affairs correspondent, Sarah Martinez, met Bobby at Mickey's Diner, the same booth where he and Jimmy had shared 68 years of friendship. As Bobby spoke, his weathered hands traced patterns on the worn table surface. "Jimmy and I weren't heroes," Bobby began. "We were just kids who got thrown into something bigger than ourselves. But we learned what it meant to have someone's back, no matter what." Sarah leaned forward. "Mr. Sullivan, you carried your friend 2 miles through enemy territory. How is that not heroic?" Bobby's eyes grew distant. "Ma'am, when you love someone like a brother, you don't think about being a hero. You just think about getting him home." What Bobby revealed next had never been told before, not even in court. "There's something I never told anyone," Bobby continued, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "Not even Jimmy knew this. When I was carrying him through that frozen hellscape, there were moments I didn't think we'd make it." Sarah waited, sensing the weight of what was coming. "I fell 3 times. Each time, Jimmy would whisper, 'Leave me, Bobby. Save yourself. And each time, I'd think about my father's words, pick Jimmy up, and keep walking. But the third time I fell, I was done. Completely exhausted. Figured we'd both die right there. The cameraman stopped adjusting his equipment, completely absorbed in Bobby's words. That's when I heard it, voices in the distance. American voices. Our boys were looking for us. If I hadn't fallen that third time, if I hadn't stopped to rest, we would have walked right past them in the dark. The revelation sent chills through everyone present. So you see, Bobby smiled through tears, Jimmy saved my life by letting me save his. Even when he was dying, he was still taking care of me. Sarah wiped her eyes, struggling to maintain professional composure. Mr. Sullivan, what would you want people to know about veterans like Jimmy? Bobby straightened in his chair, and for a moment, Sarah could see the 19-year-old soldier he once was. I'd want them to know that every veteran has a Jimmy. Someone who had their back when the world went crazy. Someone who shared their last ration when they were hungry. Someone who carried them when they couldn't walk. He paused, gathering his thoughts. And I'd want them to know that when these heroes come home, they don't ask for parades or medals. They just ask to be remembered. To know that their sacrifice mattered. The broadcast that aired that evening would become one of the most watched veteran stories in television history. Within hours of the story airing, Bobby's phone began ringing. Veterans from across the country called to share their own stories of battlefield brotherhood. Families of fallen soldiers reached out to thank him for honoring their loved one's memory. But perhaps the most meaningful call came from an unexpected source. Mr. Sullivan. This is Colonel Patricia Hayes, U.S. Army. I'm calling from the Pentagon. Bobby nearly dropped the phone. Yes, ma'am. Mr. Sullivan, your story has reached the highest levels of our military. We'd like to invite you to Washington to receive a special recognition for your service and for keeping alive the memory of our forgotten heroes. 2 weeks later, Bobby found himself in a place he never imagined, the Pentagon. Standing in a room filled with generals and high-ranking officials, Bobby felt overwhelmed. I don't understand why I'm here, he whispered to his escort. I just told the truth about my friend. Colonel Hayes overheard. Mr. Sullivan, that's exactly why you're here. In a world full of noise, you told a simple truth about love and loyalty. That's rarer than you think. The ceremony was unlike anything Bobby had experienced. When they called his name, he walked forward with the same dignity he'd shown in Judge Caprio's courtroom. Robert Sullivan, the general announced, for exemplifying the highest ideals of military service and brotherhood, and for ensuring that the sacrifice of your fellow soldiers will never be forgotten, we present you with the Secretary of Defense Medal for Exceptional Civilian Service. As they placed the medal around his neck, Bobby did something that surprised everyone. Instead of accepting the honor gracefully, Bobby removed the medal and held it up for everyone to see. Sir, with all due respect, this medal belongs to Jimmy Thompson, who died 3 days before I met Judge Caprio. Jimmy carried me through more than just that Korean battlefield. He carried me through 68 years of friendship. The room fell silent. If I may, sir, I'd like to dedicate this honor to Jimmy and to all the Jimmys who never made it home. They're the real heroes. I was just lucky enough to be their friend. The impact of Bobby's words resonated far beyond that Pentagon ceremony room. Video clips of Bobby's speech spread across social media with the hashtag #ForAllTheJimmys. Veterans organizations across the country began sharing stories of their own Jimmys, the friends who didn't make it home, the buddies who saved their lives, the brothers and sisters in arms who deserved to be remembered. A high school teacher in Ohio used Bobby's story to teach her students about the real meaning of sacrifice. A counselor at a VA hospital shared it with veterans struggling with survivor's guilt. A military chaplain used it in memorial services for fallen soldiers. Back in Providence, Judge Caprio watched the Pentagon ceremony on television. Sitting in his chambers, he thought about the simple traffic violation that had become a lesson in humanity. His clerk knocked on the door. "Judge, there's someone here to see you." Bobby Sullivan stood in the doorway, still wearing his military dress uniform from the Pentagon ceremony. "Your Honor, I wanted to thank you again. What you did in that courtroom, it started something bigger than either of us expected." Judge Caprio stood and embraced the old veteran. "Bobby, you started it. You had the courage to tell Jimmy's story. I just had the privilege of listening." Their friendship, born in a courtroom over a speeding ticket, would continue for years to come. Every month, on the first Saturday, Judge Caprio and Bobby met at Mickey's Diner. They'd sit in the booth where Bobby and Jimmy had shared their friendship, and they'd talk about life, loss, and the power of human connection. "You know, Judge," Bobby said during one of their breakfasts, "Jimmy would have loved knowing that our story helped other people. He always said the best way to honor the dead is to help the living." Judge Caprio raised his coffee cup. "To Jimmy, and to all the friends who teach us what loyalty really means." "To Jimmy," Bobby replied, "and to never leaving anyone behind." The legacy of Bobby and Jimmy's friendship continues to inspire people around the world. The scholarship fund Judge Caprio established grew to support hundreds of military children. Bobby became a regular speaker at veterans events, always ending his talks with the same message: find your Jimmy. Be someone's Jimmy. And never, ever leave anyone behind. Years later, when reporters asked Judge Caprio about the most memorable case of his career, he always gave the same answer: it wasn't really a case at all. It was a reminder that every person who walks into our courtroom has a story worth hearing, and sometimes those stories can change the world. Bobby Sullivan proved that heroes don't always wear capes. Sometimes they wear worn jackets with small pins on the lapel. Sometimes they're 82-year-old men who keep promises made in foxholes. And sometimes, they're judges who take the time to listen to the stories that matter most forever.